As soon as the United States took possession of the land west of the Mississippi, they began to explore it. Between 1804 and 1807, Lewis and Clark explored the entire basin of the Missouri River, while Pike investigated the area between the sources of the Mississippi and the Red River. We've already seen that Bering carried over Russian investigation and dominion into Alaska. To avoid Russian encroachment down towards the Californian coast, President Monroe put forth the doctrine in 1823 that no further colonization of the Americas would be permitted by the United States. In that year, Russia agreed to limit her claims to the country north of 54.40 degrees. The states subsequently acquired California and other adjoining states during their war with Mexico in 1848, just before gold was discovered in the Sacramento Valley. The land between California and Alaska was held in joint possession between Great Britain and the States, and was known as the Oregon Territory. Lewis and Clark had explored the Columbia River, while Vancouver had much earlier examined the island which now bears his name, so both countries appear to have some rights of discovery to the district. At one time, the inhabitants of the states were inclined to claim all the country as far as the Russian boundary at 54.40 degrees, and a war cry arose, 54.40 degrees or fight. But in 1846, the territory was divided by the 49th parallel. All that remained to be known of America at that time was the ice-bound northern coast, over which so much heroic enterprise has been displayed. The history of geographical discovery in America is, in large measure, a history of conquest. Men got to know both coastlines and the interior while endeavoring either to trade or to settle where nature was propitious, or the country afforded mineral or vegetable wealth that could be easily transported. Off the coast, early knowledge was gained of geography, but where the continent widens either north or south, making the interior inaccessible for trade purposes with the coasts, ignorance remained even down to the early 20th century. It was the natural expansion of the United States, made possible by the acquisition of this tract of land from Napoleon in 1803, that brought it within the knowledge of all. This expansion was mainly due to the improved methods of communication that steam has given to mankind only within this century. But for this, the region east of the Rocky Mountains would possibly be as little known to Europeans, even today, as the Sudan or Somalia. It is due to this natural expansion of the states, and to a lesser extent of Canada, that few great names of geographical explorers are associated with our knowledge of the interior of North America. Unknown settlers have been the pioneers of geography, and not as elsewhere has the reverse been the case. In the other two continents whose geographical history we have yet to trace, Australia and Africa, explorers have preceded settlers or conquerors, and we can generally follow the course of geographical discovery in their case without the need to discuss their political history. Chapter 10. Australia and the South Seas. On the western coast of Australia, one cannot help but notice the abundance of Dutch names that dot the shoreline. Hoog Island, Demon's Bay, Houtmans Abrolhos, De Witland, and the archipelago of Knights are just a few examples, along with Dirk Hartog's Island and Cape Leeuwin. To the far north lies the Gulf of Carpentaria, and to the far south the island once known as Van Diemen's Land. It is no surprise that until the mid-1800s, the land we now call Australia was commonly referred to as New Holland. Had the Dutch explored the more fertile eastern shores of the continent, it may have remained New Holland to this day. However, few coastlines in the world are as inhospitable and unpromising as Western Australia's, and it is understandable why the Dutch, despite exploring it, did not claim it as their own. Although the Dutch were the first to explore a significant portion of the Australian coast, they were not the first to lay eyes on it. In 1542, a Spanish expedition led by Luis López de Villalobos set out to follow up on Magellan's discoveries in the Pacific Ocean within the Spanish sphere of influence. Villalobos discovered several Polynesian islands and attempted to seize the Philippines, but his fleet had to return to New Spain. One of his ships sailed along an island that was named New Guinea and was believed to be part of the great unknown southern land that Ptolemy had imagined to exist in the south of the Indian Ocean, possibly connected to Tierra del Fuego. This sparked curiosity, and in 1606 Pedro de Quiros was sent on a voyage to the South Seas with 3 ships. He discovered the New Hebrides and believed it to be part of the southern continent, which he named Australia del Espiritu Santo. He hurried back to Spain to secure the viceroyalty of this new possession. One of his ships became separated from him, and the commander, Luis Vaz de Torres, sailed farther to the southwest, discovering that New Australia was not a continent but an island. He ventured forth until he reached New Guinea, which he sailed along the southern coast. Upon seeing land to the south, he navigated through the straits that now bear his name, and was likely the first European to lay eyes on the continent of Australia. In that same year of 1606, the Dutch vessel known as the Duifken charted nearly 1,000 miles along the south and west coasts of New Guinea until they reached Cape Keerweer, or Turn Again. This was likely the northwest coast of Australia. During the first 30 years of the 17th century, the Dutch explored the west coast of Australia with the same vigor that the Portuguese had shown in their exploration of the west coast of Africa. The Dutch left their mark on the land, with islands, bays, and capes bearing their names. In 1616, Dirk Hartog discovered the land that now bears his ship's name, as well as the cape and roadstead that bear his own name. Jan Edels left his mark on the western coast in 1619, while 3 years later, a ship named the Lioness, or Leeuwin, reached the continent's westernmost point, which still bears its name. In 1627, De Niets sailed along the south coast of Australia, while that same year, a Dutch commander named Carpenter discovered and named the vast indentation now known as the Gulf of Carpentaria. However, the most significant discoveries were made in 1642 by an expedition sent from Batavia under the leadership of Abel Jansen Tasman, who sought to explore the true extent of the southern land. After the voyages of the Leeuwin and De Niets, it was evident that the southern coast of the new land trended eastward rather than westward, as Ptolemy had believed. Tasman's task was to determine whether it was connected to the great southern land believed to lie south of South America. Tasman set sail from Mauritius and headed southeast, going much farther south than Cape Leeuwin, until he finally reached land at latitude 43.30 degrees and longitude 163.50 degrees. He called it Van Diemen's Land, after the Governor-General of Batavia, and it was assumed to be connected to the land discovered by De Niets. Sailing further east, Tasman came out into the open sea, proving that the newly discovered land was not connected to the great unknown continent around the South Pole. But he soon came across land which might possibly answer to that description, and he called it Statenland, in honor of the States General of the Netherlands. This was undoubtedly some part of New Zealand. Still steering eastward, but with a more northerly trend, Tasman discovered several islands in the Pacific and ultimately reached Batavia after touching on New Guinea. His discoveries were a great advance on previous knowledge. He had at least reduced the possible dimensions of the unknown continent of the South within narrow limits. His discoveries were justly inscribed upon the map of the world cut in stone upon the new Stadhuis in Amsterdam, in which the name New Holland was given by order of the States General to the western part of the Terra Australis. When England for a time became joined to Holland under the rule of William III, William Dampier was dispatched to New Holland to make further discoveries. He retraced the explorations of the Dutch from Dirk Hartog's Bay to New Guinea, and appears to have been the first European to have noticed the habits of the kangaroo. Otherwise, his voyage did not add much to geographical knowledge, though when he left the coasts of New Guinea, he steered between New England and New Ireland. As a result of these Dutch voyages, the existence of a great land somewhere to the southeast of Asia became common knowledge to all civilized men. As an instance of this familiarity, many years before Cook's epoch-making voyages, it may be mentioned that in 1699, Captain Lemuel Gulliver arrived at the kingdom of Lilliput by steering northwest from Van Diemen's Land, which he mentions by name. Lilliput was situated somewhere in the neighbourhood of the Great Bight of Australia. This curious mixture of definite knowledge and vague ignorance on the part of Swift exactly corresponds to the state of geographical knowledge about Australia in his days, as shown in a map of those parts of the world by the great French cartographer d'Anville in 1745. The discoveries made by the Spanish and Dutch were a direct result of the great search for the Spice Islands. These discoveries were mostly made by ships that were outfitted in the Malay archipelago, if not from the Spice Islands themselves. However, at the beginning of the 18th century, new motives came into play in the quest for new lands. By that time, almost the entire coastline of the world was roughly known. The Portuguese had explored the coast of Africa, the Spanish had explored South America, the English had explored most of the east of North America, and the Spaniards had explored Central America. Many of the islands of the Pacific Ocean had been touched upon, although not accurately surveyed. There remained only the northwest coast of America and the northeast coast of Asia to be explored. The great remaining problem of geography was to discover if the great southern continent assumed by Ptolemy existed, and if so, what its dimensions were. All of these problems of coastline geography, if we may call it that, were destined to be solved by one man, an Englishman named James Cook, who, along with Prince Henry, Magellan, and Tasman, may be said to have determined the limits of the habitable land. Cook's voyages were made in the interests of scientific curiosity, not trade or conquest. Appropriately enough, they were begun in the interests of a different science than that of geography. The English astronomer Halley had left as a sort of legacy the task of examining the transit of Venus, which he predicted for the year 1769, pointing out its paramount importance for determining the distance of the Sun from the Earth. This transit could only be observed in the southern hemisphere, and it was to observe it that Cook made his first voyage of exploration. There was a double suitability in the motive of Cook's first voyage. The work of his life could only have been carried out owing to the improvement in nautical instruments that had been made during the early part of the 18th century. Halley had invented the sextant, by which the sun's elevation could be taken with much more ease and accuracy than with the old cross-staff, the very rough gnomon that the earlier navigators had to use. More important for scientific geography was the improvement that had taken place in accurate chronometry. Finding the latitude of a place is not so difficult. The length of the day at different times of the year will almost be enough to determine this, as seen in the very earliest history of Greek geography. But determining the longitude was a much more difficult task, which in the earlier stages could only be formed by guesswork and dead reckonings. There was a need for a clock that is highly precise and accurate, which can be used to determine the difference in local time between any spot on the Earth's surface and that of the port from which the ship sailed, or from some fixed place. The English government, seeing the importance of this, proposed a very large reward of $10,000 for the invention of a chronometer that would not lose more than a stated number of minutes during a year. This prize was won by John Harrison, and from this time onward a sea captain with a minimum of astronomical knowledge was able to know his longitude within a few minutes. Hadley's sextant and Harrison's chronometer were the necessary implements to enable James Cook to do his work, which was thus, both in aim and method, in every way English. James Cook was a practical sailor, who had shown considerable intelligence in sounding the St. Lawrence on Wolfe's expedition, and had afterward been appointed Marine Surveyor of Newfoundland. When the Royal Society determined to send out an expedition to observe the transit of Venus, according to Halley's prediction, they were deterred from entrusting the expedition to a scientific man by the example of Halley himself, who had failed to obtain obedience from sailors on being entrusted with the command. Dalrymple, the chief hydrographer of the Admiralty, who had chief claims to the command, was also somewhat of a faddist, and Cook was selected almost as a last resort. The choice was a wise one. He chose a coal ship called the Endeavour, weighing 360 tons, because its wide beam allowed it to carry more supplies and navigate near coasts. Just before they set sail, Captain Wallis returned from a voyage around the world, during which he discovered or rediscovered Tahiti. He suggested it as a suitable location for observing the transit. Cook arrived there as planned, and on June 3, 1769, the main objective of the expedition was achieved with a successful observation. However, he continued on and soon arrived at a land that he believed to be the Staten Land of Tasman. But upon exploring the coast, Cook discovered that it was not part of a great southern continent, but rather two islands, separated by a strait that he named after himself. Leaving New Zealand on March 31, 1770, he discovered another land to the west that was previously unknown to mariners. He entered an inlet, and with the help of Mr. Joseph Banks, the naturalist of the expedition, explored the area. He found so many new plants that the bay was named Botany Bay. He then continued northward and nearly lost his ship on the great reef running down the eastern coast. However, by staying within the reef, he managed to reach the southern point of the strait named after Torres, and proved that it was distinct from New Guinea. Cook named this immense coast New South Wales, as it bore some resemblance to the coast near Swansea. Through this first voyage, Cook proved that neither New Holland nor Staten Land belonged to the great Antarctic continent, which remained the only myth left by the ancients that had not yet been removed from maps. In his second voyage, starting in 1772, he was tasked with definitively solving this problem. He immediately set sail for the Cape of Good Hope, and from there embarked on a meandering journey around the southern pole, exploring every direction as far south as possible, only stopping when he encountered ice. Despite his efforts, he failed to discover any extensive land corresponding to the supposed Antarctic continent, definitively proving its non-existence. He spent the rest of his voyage rediscovering various archipelagos that previous Spanish, Dutch, and English navigators had touched but had not accurately surveyed. Later, Cook crossed the Pacific from New Zealand to Cape Horn without discovering any extensive land, conclusively settling the matter after 3 years of careful inquiry. Remarkably, during that long time, he lost only 4 out of 118 men, and only one of them to sickness. Only one great problem in maritime geography remained to be solved: the Northwest Passage, which had been attempted many times by English navigators working from the east through Hudson's Bay. In 1776, George III appointed Cook to attempt to solve this problem through a new method. He was instructed to find an opening on the northwest coast of America that would lead into Hudson's Bay. The old legend of Juan de Fuca's Great Bay still misled geographers about this coast. Cook not only solved this problem, but also, by advancing through the Bering Strait and examining both sides of it, determined that the two continents of Asia and America approached each other as close as 36 miles. On his return voyage, he landed in Hawaii, where he was killed in 1777. His ships returned to England without adding anything further to geographical knowledge. Cook's voyages had inspired the generous emulation of the French, who, to their eternal credit, ordered their fleet to respect his vessels wherever found, even though France was at war with England at the time. In 1783, an expedition was sent under François de la Pérouse to complete Cook's work. He explored the northeast coast of Asia, examined the island of Sakhalin, and passed through the strait between it and Japan, often called by his name. In Kamchatka, Laperouse disembarked Monsieur Lesseps, who had joined the expedition as a Russian interpreter. Lesseps examined Kamchatka himself, and then journeyed overland to Paris, becoming the first European to complete a journey across the Old World from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean. Laperouse followed Cook's path by exploring the coast of New South Wales. He was surprised to find English ships settling the first Australian colony in 1787, when he entered a harbour in the middle of the coast. Laperouse delivered his surveys to the Englishmen and then attempted to survey the coast of New Holland. However, his expedition was never heard from again. It was not until 1826 that it was discovered that they had been wrecked on Vanikoro, an island near the Fijis. Cook's exploration of the eastern coast of Australia was soon followed by a settlement. Captain Phillips led a group of convicts to Botany Bay, and from that time onward, English explorers gradually determined the coastline and interior of the vast land known as Australia. One of the ships that had accompanied Cook on his second voyage had made a rough survey of Van Diemen's Land, concluding that it joined the mainland. However, in 1797, Bass, a Navy surgeon, travelled down from Port Jackson to the south in a whaleboat with a crew of 6 men and discovered open sea running between the southernmost point and Van Diemen's Land. This is now known as the Bass Strait. Bass's companion Flinders coasted along the south coast from Cape Leeuwin eastward in 1799 and met a French ship at Encounter Bay. Flinders continued and discovered Port Phillip. The coastline of Australia was approximately settled after Captain P.P. King investigated the river mouths in 4 voyages between 1817 and 1822. The interior of Australia remained uncharted for many years. The Blue Mountains on the east coast made exploration difficult due to their numerous gullies, which often led explorers to dead ends. However, in 1813, Philip Wentworth managed to cross the mountains and discovered a fertile plateau to the west. The following year, Evans discovered the Lachlan and Macquarie rivers and explored the Bathurst Plains further. From 1828 to 1829, Captain Sturt traced the course of the Darling and Murray rivers, increasing knowledge about the interior. In 1848, Leichhardt lost his life attempting to explore the interior northward. However, in 1860, Burke and Wills managed to pass from south to north along the east coast, and between 1858 and 1862, John McDowell Stewart crossed the center of the continent from south to north to trace a course for the telegraph line. Settlements had already sprung up along the eastern coast of Australia by this time, leaving only the western desert to be explored. John Forrest explored the desert in 2 journeys between 1868 and 1874, and Ernest Giles did the same to the north between 1872 and 1876. In 1897, the Honourable Daniel Carnegie joined these routes with his journey from the Coolgardie goldfields in the south to those of Kimberley in the north. During the latter part of the 19th century, despite these explorations, the impression was that the interior of Australia was not worth knowing. Chapter 11. Exploration and Partition of Africa. The Portuguese, in their quest for a route to the Indies, slowly navigated the African coastline during the 15th century. By the end of the century, their mariners had created rough yet effective charts of the African coastlines on both the west and east sides. They not only explored the coast, but also established settlements, such as Amina on the Guinea coast, Loando near the Congo, and Benguela on the western coast, from which they dispatched gold, ivory, and, most importantly, slaves, which became the primary African commodities for Europeans. On the east coast, they settled in Sofala, a port of Mozambique, and possessed 3 ports in Zanzibar, the first visited by Vasco da Gama, and later celebrated by Milton in his book. It is likely that the Portuguese also made explorations into the interior, and some maps from the 16th and 17th centuries show remarkable knowledge of the course of the Nile, which terminates in 3 large lakes that are likely the Victoria and Albert Nyanza and Tanganyika. The Mountains of the Moon are also prominently featured, and it was only recently that Mr. Stanley rediscovered them. However, it is difficult to determine whether these entries on the Portuguese maps were due to actual knowledge or report, or to the traditions of an earlier knowledge of these lakes and mountains. The same information is found in the maps accompanying the early editions of Ptolemy and repeated by Arabic geographers, obviously from Ptolemy and not from actual observation. When the French cartographers Delisle and D'Anville decided not to include anything on their maps for which they had no evidence, these lakes and mountains disappeared. Thus, maps from the 17th century often appear to display more knowledge of the interior of Africa than those from the beginning of the 19th century, at least with regard to the sources of the Nile. The exploration of Africa's interior began with the quest to uncover the origins of the Nile. Today we know the courses of 3 other great rivers, the Niger, the Zambezi, and the Congo, thanks largely to the efforts of British explorers. The names of Bruce and Grant will forever be linked to the Nile, while Mungo Park is remembered for his work on the Niger, Dr. Livingstone for the Zambezi, and Mr. Stanley for the Congo. For centuries the source of the Nile remained a mystery. Ancient traditions suggested that the river might flow westward and become the Niger, or that it might even join with the Tigris and Euphrates. But no one knew for sure. It was a task that seemed impossible. In 1768, James Bruce, a Scottish gentleman with a passion for exploration, set out to solve this mystery. He had already gained some knowledge of Arabic and African customs as a consul in Algiers. He travelled up the Nile to Farsant, then crossed the desert to the Red Sea. From there he sailed to Massawa and began his search for the Nile's source in Abyssinia. Bruce visited the ruins of Aksum, the former capital, and it was there that he witnessed the event that would forever be associated with his travels. He saw a cow have 2 rump steaks extracted while still alive, the wound sewn up, and the animal driven on. With characteristic pertinacity, Bruce continued his search until he finally discovered the source of the Nile. Guided by some gallus, he made his way up the Blue Nile to the 3 fountains, which he declared to be the true sources of the Nile, and identified with the 3 mysterious lakes in the old maps. From there, he travelled down the Nile, reaching Cairo in 1773. Of course, what he had discovered was merely the source of the Blue Nile, and even this had been previously visited by a Portuguese traveller named Pays. But the interesting adventures he experienced and the captivating style in which he recounted them aroused universal attention. This attention was perhaps increased by the fact that his journey was undertaken purely from a love of adventure and discovery. The year 1768 marked the 2 journeys of James Cook and James Bruce, both of them expressly for the purpose of geographical discovery, thus inaugurating the era of what may be called scientific exploration. 10 years later, an association was formed named the African Association, expressly intended to explore the unknown parts of Africa, and the first geographical society called into existence. In 1795, Mungo Park was dispatched by the association to the west coast. He started from the Gambia, and after many adventures, in which he was captured by the Moors, arrived at the banks of the Niger, which he traced along its middle course but failed to reach as far as Timbuktu. He made a second attempt in 1805, hoping by sailing down the Niger to prove its identity with the river known at its mouth as the Congo. However, he was forced to return and died at Busa without having determined the remaining course of the Niger. Attention was thus drawn to the existence of the mysterious city of Timbuktu, of which Mungo Park had brought back curious rumours on his return from his first journey. This was visited in 1811 by a British seaman named Adams, who had been wrecked on the Moorish coast and taken as a slave by the Moors across to Timbuktu. He was ultimately ransomed by the British consul at Mogador, and his account revived interest in West African exploration. Attempts were made to penetrate the secret of the Niger, both from Senegambia and the Congo, but both ended in failure. A fresh method was adopted, possibly owing to Adams's experience in the attempt to reach the Niger by the caravan routes across the Sahara. In 1822, Major Denham and Lieutenant Clapperton left Merzouk, the capital of Fezzan, and made their way to Lake Chad and then to Bornu. Later on, Clapperton again visited the Niger from Benin. In 1826 and 1827, Timbuktu was visited by two Europeans, Major Laing in the former year, who was murdered there, and a young Frenchman, René Cailly, in the latter. His account aroused great interest, and Tennyson began his poetic career with a prize poem on the subject of the mysterious African capital. It was not until 1850 that the work of Denham and Clapperton was again taken up by Barth, who for 5 years explored the whole country to the west of Lake Chad, visiting Timbuktu and connecting the lines of the route of Clapperton and Cailly. What he did for the west of Lake Chad was accomplished by Nachtigal east of that lake in Darfur and Wadai, in a journey which likewise took 5 years, from 1869 to 1874. During the early 20th century, political interests resulted in numerous expeditions, especially by the French, to connect their possessions in Algeria and Tunisia with those on the Gold Coast and Senegal. The next chapter in the African saga is intimately linked with the name of a man who can be credited with nearly all of the recent discoveries. Through his skillful handling of the local population, his unflinching determination, and his unwavering bravery, David Livingstone managed to unlock the secrets of the uncharted territories of Central Africa. He began his journey in 1849, departing from the Cape and heading northward towards the Zambezi River. From there he travelled to Lake Dilolo, and after 5 years of wandering, he reached the western coast of Africa at Loanda. He then retraced his steps back to the Zambezi and followed the river's course to its mouth on the east coast, thus becoming the first person to cross Africa from west to east. On his second journey, which began in 1858, Livingstone began tracing the course of the Sheer River, the most significant tributary of the Zambezi. In doing so, he arrived on the shores of Lake Nyassa in September of 1859. Meanwhile, 2 other explorers, Captain Burton, later Sir Richard, and Captain Speke, had departed from Zanzibar to search for a lake that had been rumoured to exist for some time. The following year, they successfully reached Lake Tanganyika. Upon their return, Speke parted ways with Burton and took a more northerly route, where he saw another great lake that would later be identified as the Victoria Nyanza. In 1860, accompanied by another companion, Captain Grant, Speke returned to the Victoria Nyanza and traced its course. To the north of the lake, they discovered a great river that flowed northward, which they followed as far as Gondokoro. There they encountered Mr. Baker, later Sir Samuel, who had travelled up the White Nile to investigate its source. They were able to prove that the source of the Nile was indeed Lake Victoria Nyanza. Baker continued his search and discovered another source of the Nile in a smaller lake to the west, which he named Albert Nyanza. Thus these 3 Englishmen banded together to solve the age-old mystery of the Nile's sources. The Englishmen's discoveries were quickly followed by important political action from the Khedive of Egypt, Ismail Pasha. He claimed the entire Nile as part of his dominion and established stations all along it. This led to the acquisition of full information about the Nile's basin for geographical purposes. Under the leadership of Sir Samuel Baker and Colonel Gordon, civilization took possession of the Nile from its source to its mouth. Meanwhile, Livingstone set out to solve the problem of the great Lake Tanganyika and embarked on his final journey in 1865 for that purpose. He discovered Lakes Moero and Bangweolo, as well as the river Nyangwe, also known as Lualaba. Livingstone's previous exploits of discovery had aroused so much interest that, when nothing had been heard of him for some time, Mr. H.M. Stanley was sent by the proprietors of the New York Herald to find him in 1869. Stanley had previously acted as a war correspondent for the Herald. He started in 1871 from Zanzibar, and before the end of the year came across a white man in the heart of the Dark Continent. Stanley greeted him with the historic query, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" 2 years later, Livingstone died, a martyr to geographical and missionary enthusiasm. His work was taken up by Mr. Stanley, who was again dispatched in 1876 to continue Livingstone's work. Stanley succeeded in crossing the Dark Continent from Zanzibar to the mouth of the Congo, tracing the whole course of the mighty stream and proving that the Lualaba or Nyangwe were merely different names or affluents of this fourth great river of the continent. Stanley's remarkable journey completed the rough outline of African geography by defining the course of this great river.